Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatoria. So, due to popular demand, I now have a lapel mic attached to my camera. So hopefully the sound will be a little bit better than previously, but I've tested this lavalier mic and I know it's not fantastic. I know it's a little bit crackly, so please forgive me that. Right. So I made a video recently talking about daggers, and one of the things that came up in that is I made a passing comment that relates to a much more complicated point, and I made a passing comment about rondel daggers, which you all probably watching this channel know what a rondel dagger is. It's one of these. You'll notice it's got two discs. Sometimes they only have one disc, but anyway, the rondels are the roundels, or the discs, part of the hilt. I said that rondel daggers are higher status than bollock daggers. So what's a bollock dagger? It's one of these with two little bollocks, okay, which looks like, that's right, it looks like a rude shape, and it is supposed to. Now, some people immediately, a few, not many, some people got annoyed that I had said that. So I want to clarify and defend that point slightly. So first of all, absolutely, there were lower status people. What do I mean by low status and high status? Well, in other words, your social position. So social class was quite important. In fact, even in legal terms, it was important in the medieval world. So when I'm talking about high status, thinking about people who own property, own land, maybe employ lots of people, or have an estate which employs people. The type of people who in military terms would be knights or men-at-arms, this sort of thing. When I say low status, within a military context, what I'm really talking about are people who, rather than serving as a man-at-arms or a knight in warfare, would serve as something more like an archer, or a spearman, or a billman, or something like this, or crossbowman, a gunner, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, there is obviously a social gap between those people, but I'm not necessarily literally talking about the top of society, in other words, kings, and I'm not necessarily talking about the bottom of society, that is serfs, although that's a term in this period which is somewhat problematic, but shall we say the lowest level of people. I'm talking about essentially working class people, in modern terms, working class people, and probably upper middle class people. So as some people objected to, they went, but there are very high status versions of bollock daggers. And yes, that is true. However, if we reverse that around, there aren't many what we would call low status versions of rondel daggers. Now, I was talking previously about eating knives. This is yet another medieval eating knife. This is a more typical size one than the large kind of butcher's knife or carving knife size one I showed before. This is the sort of size of eating knife that anybody in medieval Europe would have probably had one or more of lying around. This is the sort of thing that literally on a day-to-day basis people would eat with. Now, could these have been used in violence? Yes, just like any object can, just like a bottle or a glass unfortunately might be used in violence in the modern world, or even a stick or a hammer or a screwdriver. It doesn't need to be a specialised weapon to be used as a weapon, of course. And so undoubtedly kitchen knives or eating knives were used a lot in medieval violence, just as they are the go-to knife for modern knife crime as well. But they are a very different thing to a specialised dagger or fighting knife. Okay, this is not something that in any normal situation you would find yourself trying to carve food or eat with. It's got very different characteristics to this. Yes, both of them can stab people, just like any pointy object can stab someone, okay? But these are very specialized. They have much more robust blades. The edge geometry isn't really specialized towards, carving stuff or cutting up meat. These are very thin blades and light and fairly thin at the junction, or not all of them, but a lot of them are very thin at the junction between the handle or hilt and the blade, because strength isn't a major consideration. These have to be strong, they have to be able to sustain lateral forces and forces in every direction, be bashed around. They equally have to have robust points enabled for penetrating through thick clothing at the least, and potentially armour like mail at the most. and jamming in between plates of plate armor and stuff like this, and maybe defending against a blow from a sword, all this kind of stuff. So very different considerations for a fighting knife. And incidentally, in the modern world, or at least in the modern world and recent historical world, the best comparison would be comparing a kitchen knife with a bayonet or a fighting knife. If you look at something like a modern bayonet or a Fairbairn Sykes commando dagger or something like this, any kind of fighting knife really, the blade will be very much more robust and thicker than it is on an eating knife for obvious reasons. So going back to the original point, rondel daggers. So rondel daggers occupy a very special place in society because they are associated with, at least at the beginning, they're very much associated with the knightly classes, men-at-arms, the people who wear full armour, probably carry a long sword or an arming sword at least, and usually fight on horseback in most countries, and if they're fighting on foot in armour, would use something like a poleaxe quite a lot of the time. So these are what we commonly refer to as knights, although most of them weren't actually knighted and weren't therefore technically knights. And the dagger that represented this class was the rondel dagger. Now, if we look at medieval and early Renaissance, or for the first half of the Renaissance combat treatises, this is the predominant dagger. There are a couple of glimpses of bullock daggers, okay? So they're not completely missing from the record, they are there. And equally, there is a written reference to the basilard, which is a dagger I'm not going to go into particularly in this video, but that's another type of dagger that was very popular in the late 14th century, and hung around a bit in the 15th century, but was more or less these essentially kind of overwhelmed it in popularity. Okay, so these were for the 15th century, which is where most of the medieval treatises we work from come from. These were the predominant two dagger types, the rondel dagger and the bullock dagger, in the archaeological record in terms of the actual daggers that were being used. Now, statistically, bullock daggers, it seems, certainly in Northern Europe, certainly in England and France and Germany as far as I'm aware, the bullock dagger far outnumbered the rondel dagger. And the reason for that is because this was the dagger predominantly carried by normal people if they wanted a fighting knife. So, if we go a little bit into the into the middle of the 16th century to 1545, and we look at the shipwreck of the Mary Rose. So the Mary Rose sunk in 1545, and it is absolutely full of bullock daggers. And if you go to the Mary Rose Museum today, which is in Portsmouth in England, one of the peculiarities of the archaeological site of the shipwreck of the Mary Rose was that organic material like wood or bone or horn survived, and metal for the most part didn't, unless it was very big, like a cannon barrel. So there are almost no blades surviving, but there are lots of hilts surviving. And pretty much all of the hilt, not all, but most, let's say like 98% of the dagger hilts from the Mary Rose are bullock daggers. And it seems that bullock daggers were the predominant typical soldier's dagger hilt, and not only soldiers, civilian as well, and I'll talk about that in a second. They were the predominant fighting knife or fighting dagger hilt of the 15th century, certainly in England and in a lot of other European countries as well. There are a few exceptions to that. Switzerland, for example, the basilard, a later evolution of the basilard predominated in Switzerland, and the name basilard might come from basil, actually. So the rondel dagger, in contrary, is a very specialised armoured fighting weapon that was very much associated with the fully armoured knight from the second half, mostly the later part of the 14th century, right the way through the 15th century, that is the 1400s, and into the 16th century, into about the middle of the 16th century. So for people who would fight in armour and very much of the time on horseback, this was the typical dagger that they wore. Not always, not all of them. Some of them had bullock daggers, indeed. Some of them had basilards, some of them had quillon daggers, some of them had other things. But generally speaking, this was the most common type of knightly dagger. So, coming back to my statement, Do you find high status bollock daggers? Yes, absolutely. But you don't find many low status rondel daggers. The rondel dagger is associated with the armoured fighting classes, the knightly classes, that is the gentry, the aristocracy and the upper middle classes. The bollock dagger seems to have been predominantly associated with the working classes, the more common soldiery, the longbowmen, the pikemen, this type of thing, and in fact survived into the 16th century, and you could say later via the Highland dirk, which was an evolution of this. This was predominantly associated with the common fighting classes, but much like the Langmesser, which has a similar social position in society at that period, you do get a very high status, even to the top levels, you know, kings and emperors versions of this, just the same as we get top level of society versions of the Langmesser. So I hope that sort of helps clarify the situation. Not to say that all bollock knives are low class. Of course, you get low class ones and high class ones, but most people carrying bollock daggers seem to have been working class people, whereas the rondel dagger was predominantly seen as a high class dagger and associated with the knightly classes, people who might fight in armour. Now, I said just briefly before I finish, I said I'd mention civilian life. All medieval weapons could be carried, or certainly medieval sidearms could be carried in civilian life. So if you were a knight on the battlefield, but you were going about town, you were, you know, at peace and going shopping, you might wear this, or you might wear a longsword, because that's the weapon of your social class. That's the weapon that you want people to see you wearing and see associated with you. And you know, the same goes for this. There may have been subtle social reasons for a high class person having a bollock dagger instead of a rondel dagger that we don't fully understand because we don't know everything about medieval and Renaissance society. But anyway, an interesting topic. I hope that cleared a few things up, and thanks for watching. Cheers, folks.